we are pretty much there. I want to invite questions. Dan, can you discern whether we have a second mic? If we do, that'd be helpful. And I'm going to take a question from somebody who can stand up and speak loudly enough that we won't need the mic. Ted, I trust you.
Sure. So I did talk about how I think it's more helpful to think of the universe as everything in the universe having some degree of self-determination appropriate to its level, and that the word I use for that is mindfulness. That doesn't mean that I think that electrons say it's getting too crowded here, I'm going to move. But it does mean that all natural entities have, Whitehead says, an internal and an external manifestation. That part that they generate themselves and that part that comes to them from the outside. And I think that's true throughout nature. So I'll give you some of my favorite examples of that. When I was a kid, I thought I was going to be a biologist, and I remember reading books on animal behavior, all of which at the time talked about how to project human emotions onto animals was a kind of false anthropomorphizing, and that animals don't have human feelings. And I remember thinking, whoever wrote these books, these fancy biologists, they've never lived with a dog or a cat. Because I know that when my dog would go outside and she would get nettles in her coat and we would take her to the vet and the vet would shave her coat off, she would come home and she would hide under my mother's bed for 3 days. Which you would do too if some doctor shaved your head and then stuck you in the middle of people you love. Or when she grew old and her vision wasn't so good, I would come home from school and she would come running out of the house barking, woof, 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 woof. She would come up to where she was close enough to finally realize she was barking at the young master. So what would she do? She would keep barking and run past me out into the street. And she would bark for a minute out in the street, and then she would turn around and say, okay, chased him away. Nice to see you. I wasn't barking at you the whole time. Right? It was obvious that the dog was embarrassed or covering for herself. Well, now you buy books on animal behavior, and they not only don't say it's projecting onto animals, they say, where do you think your emotions came from? You're part of an evolutionary process. Of course those things that you're feeling are existent in animals deeper than you. So there's a level of mindfulness deeper. Remember, Descartes thought that animals were automata. They were just living machines. Right? So there's a level. Now already I know I'm talking higher mammals, so that's not that impressive. They have done experiments with bees where they have found that bees are capable of doing arithmetic. Bees are capable of recognizing patterns abstractly and replicating them. They've done this with kind of maze testing in mazes where the bees are rewarded for getting through one kind of pattern hole and not the other, and then they change it, the bees figure it out. Now that's a little tiny knot of neurons. That's, a bee brain is less than some of the people in Congress today, and they're doing this kind of what we used to think of as abstract symbolic thought. Bees are doing that. That's amazing, but I'll give you my all-time favorite of these kinds of, I'll give you two because I love you. They wanted to find out how is it that dung beetles know how to move the dung. Everybody knows what dung is, but you know that dung beetles, they roll the dung, that's fecal matter, they roll it into a ball, and they roll it in straight lines at night. How do they do that? So they put them in dark rooms with no lights, and the beetles couldn't move in a straight line. But when they put stars, like star-like lights in the ceiling, then all of a sudden, the beetles could move in a straight. It turns out those guys are like Magellan. They're navigating based on the stars, like the people who found Hawaii. You know, that's incredible. Those are beetles. They're not supposed to be like paying attention to astronomical lights, but there they go. My favorite of all of them. There was a professor at a university in Tokyo who did a series of experiments with slime mold. Now, slime mold are really interesting because they don't have neurons, right? They are collections of single-celled organisms living together in a colony. And so for those of us primates who like to think that thinking has to have neurons, they ought to not think at all. But here's what they did. He put them on a plate of glass. He put broth on the plate. If you cook it to a nice temperature, the room, then the slime mold will expand in all directions to try to find more broth. And then he would crank the temperature of the room down to freezing, and the slime mold would retract until the temperature got warm enough, then it would start to grow again. So his experiment was the slime mold would be comfortably bubbling along until 29 minutes. And at 30 minutes, he would crank the temperature to freezing for a couple minutes, and then he would turn it back up. 29 minutes later, crank down to freezing, turns it back up. By the fourth cycle, at 28 minutes, the slime mold freezes even though the temperature hasn't changed. That's kind of wild, isn't it? Okay, so a couple cycles where the slime mold are doing what if those were people and they were in advance of need, calculating, oh, it's about to get cold here, I ought to hunker down, we would call that anticipation. For those of you who caught the reference, you're welcome. For the rest of you, get a life. So then, after that cycle had been replicated a couple times, then he allowed the temperature to stay warm all the way through. So 2 cycles of all the way warm. By the third cycle, they don't contract anymore at 28 minutes. Then at 29 minutes, he turns it to freezing. 28 minutes later, you know what they do? They contract again. If that's not mindfulness in a colony of single-celled organisms that don't have neurons or brains, then I don't know what is. Right? So there again, far, far deeper than we anticipate, there's some kind of self-determination, there's some kind of responding, there's some kind of anticipation, but that's true biologically too, chronologically. They have done studies with newborn infants. Right? I remember this too from when my kids were born. You know, they're not aware, they don't know you, they're not really smiling. Hooey, of course they are. Right? So they did an experiment with twins in a crib where they would not give them the same amount of toys. And if they withheld toys evenly between the 2 kids, the kids were okay. But if they withheld from one kid and not the other, the kid who didn't get the toys screamed bloody murder. That indicates that newborn infants have an ethical sense. They have a sense of equity, of fairness, right? We think we teach them that because they're barbarians, but that's that bad metaphysics that people think is not metaphysics. It turns out you have been primed to be ethical over the last 14 billion years, right? That nature is welling up in you with an innate sense of justice, right? And it takes civilization to corrode it, right? But you're born with it until someone messes you up, right? So that's what I mean by mindfulness. I mean that the world is not really made of solid objects, because what we define as solid, if you look at it very, very small or very, very big, is actually moving around. And it's a coincidence of our speed and our size and our location. If you were to do a film of the Grand Canyon in which instead of having 16 squares per second, you were to have 1 square every 100,000 years, it would look like water, right? So the whole universe we live in is dynamic, interactive, and has self-determination at its own appropriate level. That seems to me to be the only way to solve the mind-body split, and way better way of describing the world. And there seems to be more. Oh, I'll give you the last one. So there was a case, there are many such cases, but there was a case in Scandinavia of a man who had been considered in a vegetative coma. That means that for 17 years, the doctors had been coming into his bedroom in the hospital and telling the mother, we should pull the plug. You're wasting time. There's no brain there. There's no activity there. He's not there. And then one very stubborn nurse used a method like what we use with Jacob, a kind of facilitated communication, in which she was able to tie a wire to his toe. And she was able to put a sign next to his toe that had a Y and an N. Do you hear what we're saying? And the toe moved imperceptibly to the Y. Right? Are you alive or are you dead? He went to the N, to the no. Right? She found out 17 years of listening to the medical experts say, pull the plug. And thank God his mother was stubborn enough to say no all that time. They discovered mindfulness in there. Right? Which means for me, every time I talk to someone in a coma, I assume that they're in a cocoon. And I talk to them as though they can hear what I'm saying. Worst thing is I'm talking to myself, but I pray a lot, so I do that anyway. Right? I want to be able to, but I think the universe opens up if we assume that there's mindfulness all the way through.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about the purpose of prayer in your kind of process theology perspective?
Sure. So what is the purpose of prayer if it's not magic or life insurance? Right? Which is what most people are motivated to pray for. So for me, prayer is first and foremost about relationship, which is, it's very easy when you're a mammal of our size to think that you are separate from the rest of the world. And what prayer allows me to do is to remember that I'm part of something grand and part of something interconnected. So for me, that's the first thing that prayer is. Second is prayer reminds me to address the universe as you and not as it. So I can talk and I can put my care out there, I can put my concerns and my hopes out there, and I have a sense that they're being recorded, they're being answered, they're being heard somehow. Third, I remember when I was a kid, I used to go outside my house. There was a military encampment in San Francisco called the Presidio. And I used to go over the wall into that military camp that now has a fence, so you can't do it anymore. But I would take my magnet and I would run my magnet in the ground, and there are these iron filings in the dirt, and they would line up along the line that the magnet made in the dirt. I think prayer is aligning our iron filings with God's lure, right? Which is all day long we are pressed to think in terms of social status, our own personal advancement, our own relationships, meeting other people's needs. All of these are good things. None of them are bad. They're all good. But we need to have a quiet space in which we can align ourselves with God's vision of ourselves and our world. And for me, that's what prayer does. And I'll say one last thing, because it's interesting. When non-Jews say pray, I spoke 2 weeks ago at a church in Los Angeles. You wouldn't believe what Christians do when they say, let's pray. Like, they all close their eyes, right? When you say to a Jew, let's pray, the Jew says, what page? Right? Normal people don't do that. They don't think that praying is reading. They think that praying is praying, right? I guess for you guys it wouldn't be what page. It would be, are they mastering the clicker for the wall or not? Frankly, that wasn't so awesome tonight, but okay. Right, so when a Jew says, why pray, part of what a Jew is asking is not just why should I talk to God or the universe, but why should I open that book? Right, so here I want to invoke a method in drama. I come from Los Angeles. Everybody in Los Angeles, me included, is really an actor. I'm working as a rabbi until I'm discovered, but I'm hoping sometime soon. So there's a method in acting called the Stanislavski Method, in which you become the character for whom this script is the right set of words. What if we approach the prayer book with a Stanislavski method? which is you can analyze it when you're done. You can critique it when you're done. But while you're holding the Siddur, be the Jew for whom those are the right words. And allow those words to flow through you as though they're your own. Because part of what prayer is about is remembering that I am not the center of my life. God is the center of my life. And if I'm praying, here's what I want, here's what I need, here's what I want, here's what I need, this is what ticks me off, this is annoying me, then I'm not praying at all. I'm just complaining and I'm just focusing on me. But if I can remember that by praying God's prayers, it pulls me out of myself. It makes me start asking questions like, what do we need? Or what's broken in the world that I need to be paying attention to? Or who's hurting or lonely or outside needing my care? Or where can I make a difference? If we bring those questions, now that's why people, when they say, I don't find the prayer book speaks to me, no, it doesn't. Because if what you're looking for is a hug and a pat on the back, and you're looking for someone to say, yes, keep focusing on yourself, the prayer book will leave you cold every time. But the prayer book is meant to lift you out of yourself, right? And it's one of the few things in our culture that does that. So for me, that's also what's happening at prayer. Process theology is also called relational theology, right? It's that nothing exists outside of relationships. That's true for God, it's true for us, it's true for the universe. So what prayer is about turning those relationships into verbal aspiration or into silent presence. You can pray without speaking. But for me, the liturgy of the prayer book is what opens me up to be standing with my people and to be able to be looking at all of God's children and asking, where am I needed? So for me, the liturgy works in that way.
I'm going all the way back here.
Hi, thank you. This is okay. Sorry. Thank you. This is really interesting. I wonder, a lot of what you're talking about, your conception of God, to me sounds kind of Buddhist, which isn't a bad thing. But I wondered what this has to do with interfaith dialogue. Like, what are the implications of your viewpoints here? And also, is there anything like specifically Jewish about this?
Okay, did everybody hear the question? So it sounds Buddhist. So what are the implications of that for interfaith dialogue? And also, isn't there anything Jewish about you, Rabbi? Although it was in a different tone. You said it nicer than that. I appreciate that. All right, so I have a couple thoughts. I am often accused of sounding Buddhist or Christian. And I never really understand why people have a concern about that, because if there's one God, then there's one truth. And that truth percolates through our different cultures, but it should shine out through our different cultures, right? Which is why the mystics of the different traditions often come so close together, right? The Buddhists teach, the Buddha taught, that the world was created by simply the sound of the letter A, ah. Right? That is to say, there was content, but it wasn't explicit verbal content. It was just kind of the opening of a vowel, just the flow of air. Well, it turns out that the Hasidic masters also taught that the only thing the children of Israel heard when they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai was the first letter of the first of the Ten Commandments, which is an aleph for ah. Right? That Judaism and Buddhism, if understood in a humane way, should sound like the core truths of Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or Taoism or any world wisdom, I would expect that. But you can't get on the World Wide Web if you don't have a portal, right? You have to go on with some address, right? So Judaism is my way of entering into the world of spirit. But God forbid that my Judaism should be limited only to what Jews have thought or taught already, and should not be open to the wisdom of the world. Much of what you think of as Jewish, we got from somewhere else, right? For example, I remember I was in Uganda. There's a Ugandan tribe that converted to Judaism, the Abayudaya tribe, and I ordained their rabbi. So I went to install him in his village. They think that lox is disgusting and Scandinavian. Right? And I can't tell you the number of times in Mbale, Uganda, I was told I don't really look Jewish. All right. Y'all in the back of the room are looking pretty Jewish by Uganda standards, but us here, not at all. Right? Because it's ultimately about a wisdom that helps us be better people. And that shouldn't be parochial, and it shouldn't be tribal. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't stand in a particular place. The world isn't better if we get rid of our differences. The world is better if we love each other's differences, not just our commonalities. But the core insights that everything is one, that we all are connected to each other, that we are all family, that all life is related, I think that echoes through all the great traditions of the world. And that's where we have what to strengthen each other with, and then we express it in our own ways.
Hi, Rabbi. I'm very impressed listening to you, and I know my wife will be very nervous when I say this. I hope you aren't offended with this question. But
I hope for your sake I'm not.
I'd love to know your path to conservative pulpit when you had Ellison as your teacher, and your thinking, at least for this evening, seems very enlightened for a Reformed Jew, as I see it. And I'd love to know where conservative Judaism brings you to this point.
Awesome. So the question, if I could just put it into my own words, is you seem like a civilized and enlightened person, so why aren't you one of us? I don't know why your wife would think I'd be offended by that. No, I think he wants me to answer that first. So I grew up a member of a Reformed synagogue, but not a very good member of a Reformed synagogue, meaning my parents were pretty hostile to religion, so we joined the Reformed synagogue because it was the least demanding and the most prestigious. It was both of those things, a gorgeous, gorgeous building. And we never attended, like really never attended. I went to school on Yom Kippur, and then we drove to my aunt's house to break the fast eating non-kosher food. But that was all we did. So I wasn't a good Reformed Jew. And I thought religion was for stupid people. And the Reformed Judaism that I grew up with was very, I'm going to use grown-up words, not what I would have called it then, very majestic and austere. So it was high church music. It was Lewandowski and Sulzer and, the great classic music. Okay, so that's not really good for 15-year-old atheists from San Francisco. And so I put my energy elsewhere. I was on the crew team in high school and in college. Did I mention I went to Harvard? And I got interested in religion because my college roommate was a fundamentalist Christian. And I admired him so much. And I couldn't really worry about being stupid in his presence. He is now a doctor of surgery at Johns Hopkins, and he got a PhD in addition to his MD in computer science so he could develop computer models for people to do heart surgery. So many things he might be, but stupid is not on the list. So I knew I couldn't believe his story, and I wanted to think about God, and I went to talk to the Hillel rabbi, and he said, there's no neutral place to think about God from. And so he got me to agree to go to synagogue for 2 months, and he gave me a book of Franz Rosenzweig, who was a German Jewish theologian who came back to Judaism from a Reform family. I am by nature a team player, and I am by nature someone who likes to throw himself into something way too much. So there's a great deal that I love and admire about Reform Judaism, but I loved the depth that I found in conservative Judaism. And I found a balance. That is not to say Reform is shallow, but it is to say I wanted a place where the people wanted to pray traditionally, and I wanted a place where people wanted to learn traditionally, but I wanted a place where they could think uninhibitedly. And it seemed to me that conservative was that midway place that had many of the strengths of the other denominations fused together. The other benefit is that having grown up never going to shul, I didn't have any bad rabbi experiences or bad Hebrew school experiences from which I was fleeing, right? And that has served me well in my adult life because it means that I approach Jewish sources without having had the love of it beaten out of me. Or, for example, the love of God. You know, my love of God is very simple and in some ways very primitive. God and I have a deeply personal relationship that I think would have been harder to have if I had had bad Hebrew school to undo. I don't know if that answers your question or not. You're going to have to work way harder to offend me.
Hi. You mentioned a couple of times God can't break the rules. Could you expound on that a little?
Yes. So when I say God can't break the rules, I actually mean two things, one of which I try to avoid saying because it's just, complicated. If God, to exist is to have some degree of agency. Nothing that exists doesn't have the ability to have implications for the things around it. So when you act as though God could break the rules, that's just another way of saying God really didn't create anything. But that seems absurd to me. You really exist. And if you really exist, look, it's like saying I want to have children and then I want to make all their decisions for them. Right? You can make all the decisions in your life or you can have children. But you can't do both because children are going to make decisions. So God could be all-powerful or God could be a creator. But there's just no way for God to be both because once you create stuff, then that stuff starts interacting. Read the Bible, and God is constantly shocked. Wait, I didn't mean for you guys to do that, right? That's more or less the subtitle of the entire Torah, right? Right? It never occurred to me that they would make that choice, said the Holy One, right? So I think it's more, and the other thing I want to say is, look, there's a part of me that would like to live in a fairy tale world in which God can break the rules. I would love to be able to be such a holy man that I could look at someone sick and I would heal them of their sickness because I could channel the divine and poof, make it go away. But here's the question I want to ask you. In the Holocaust, 1 million babies were murdered. If God could stop evil from happening, wouldn't that have been a moment that you would think that God would have intervened? 1 million babies. And you don't need to have that be your only example. Look at slavery in this country. Don't you think that a God who had the capacity to do something would have done something? I'm not talking about like a hangnail. Oof, I hate when this happens. God, take care of it for me. I'm talking about widespread intergenerational suffering, right? So if you believe in a God who could do anything, then you have to concede either that God doesn't know about it, which is possible, or that God is not good. But you can't have God being all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good unless you are going to stop meaning by those words what everybody means by those words. Right? Let's use God as all-knowing and all-powerful, and my son has autism. Then the inescapable conclusion is God either caused my son to have autism or allowed my son to have autism. Now, for purposes of experiment, let's shift that. And let's say the guy who lives in the house next door to me is a pervert and a mad scientist. And he has come up with a drug that he's able to give to children, and that afflicts them with autism. And so he does that. To one out of every 100 kids, he has them drink the drink, and they become autistic. What would the legal consequences of that guy be? Right? Meaning, he would be prosecuted if some parent didn't bash his head in first. And nobody would say, don't bash his head in. They would all say, let me take a swing. Right? Why would that not be true for God? If your vision of God is a God who lets babies burn, a God who allows tsunamis to wash people away, a God who allows the kind of racial violence that is plaguing this country to go unchecked, how can you worship that God and think you're being ethical? So for me, the only thing that can give is to say, I refuse to compromise on God's goodness and God's justice. That I know from the Bible, that I know from my heart, that I know from my life. African Americans marched from slavery to freedom, singing the songs of Moses and the children of Israel. That story has set more people free across the millennia than anything ever has. That's the voice of my God. I will not compromise God's goodness and God's justice. But then the two things that have to compromise are God can't be all-knowing. Jews don't like that. We think that means they shouldn't send their kids to Ivy League schools. I am not telling you where your grandchildren should go to school. That you can be very smart and not be all-knowing. The God of the Torah is very smart, but doesn't know everything. Right? It turns out there's no biblical way to say all-knowing. There's a Greek and a Latin way to say that, because it's a Goyish concept. Right? So the God of the Torah is very smart, but not omniscient. And the God of the Torah is not all-powerful. There are lots of things the God of the Torah can't do. Right? One of them is to get us to behave decently. Right? So my commitment to God's being just and loving forces me to concede what it turns out my tradition has said all along, which is God is very powerful but persuasively powerful, not coercively powerful, and God is very wise but not all-knowing. And that means God needs us to be partners. If there is to be justice and love in this world, God needs us to step up and do our part. This I believe with all my heart. I also believe that 90% of American Jews believe that too. They just don't know they're allowed to.
It sounds to me a bit like what you're describing is what Martin Buber talked about, the I and thou relationship.
Is that a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Excuse me, my app in my head is rendering that into a question. In what ways, Rabbi, is your thinking similar to and different from that of Martin Buber in his I-thou relationship? So here's the... I love Martin Buber's thinking. I'm deeply inspired by it. I don't find it helpful by itself. Right? It's a poetic and beautiful way of describing two ways we relate in the world. But he has nothing to say about how do we build community, what's the nature of Torah, did God give the Torah or not, what happens when we die, right? All of those kinds of big religious questions, Buber has nothing to say except I, thou, I, thou, I, thou, right? And that's because he wasn't a systemic philosopher. He and Heschel are poets of the soul, right? But they're not systemic philosophers. They don't tell you, here's the basis, and then here's how you build on it, right? So that's why people quote Heschel all the time. But if you've ever tried reading one of his books, you finish the chapter, you say, my God, that was one of the most moving things I've ever read. Then someone says, what did it say? And you say, I don't remember. Right? That's because neither of them did us the courtesy of systemically laying it out. I think the person who did that best was Alfred North Whitehead, who also, I just want to mention, taught at Harvard. But not when I was there. I'm not that old. And so I think that using process hermeneutics and metaphysics is very compatible with Judaism. In fact, more compatible than any other system. For those of you who are going to ask the follow-up question, let me tell you what the follow-up question is. How is this like Mordechai Kaplan? right? He wasn't supernaturalist, and he also talked about an evolving civilization. And the answer is the younger Kaplan hooked himself to pragmatism. Pragmatism is a system which says that about theoretical things you shouldn't say anything. That's all well and good, but the problem is everybody has a metaphysics, and the most dangerous kind of metaphysics is the kind you can't talk about, right? So that stuck Kaplan in a bad place, but the older Kaplan quotes Whitehead and mentions Whitehead and is moving into the realm not of supernatural, but of a kind of nature bigger than just mechanics, right? And in that regard, there's a huge overlap between Kaplan's thinking, Art Green's thinking, and my thinking. But again, the challenge with Kaplan and, frankly, with Dr. Green is they're not systemic. They do a beautiful poetic description of what the eyes can see, but they don't tell me how it all holds together.
Thank you. Rabbi Artson, my question is, in your theology, does God have intent? Is there a divine purpose to the lives of our human race?
Great question. And so let me say, if I believe that mindfulness pervades the universe, then the most simple and logical explanation for that is the universe was created by a mind. So I do believe that God has intentionality. I do believe that God knows each of us individually, and that's how God is able to give us each the lure that is appropriate to us. I just don't believe in a great big Casper the Ghost floating around in the sky, right? And in that regard, I stand on many shoulders. I stand on the shoulders of Maimonides. I stand on the shoulders of Mordechai Kaplan. There are plenty of other Jewish theologians. Heschel hints at it, but he never lets you know exactly what he thinks. But the idea that God is in some... Well, look, let me say it this way. One of the pitfalls of Western thinking is we always end up saying it's either A or B. But almost everything is sometimes A and sometimes B, depending on what the it is and when it is, right? Brad, are you a rabbi or a husband? Well, to some of you, I'm a rabbi. To none of you am I a husband. But there is someone who would call me husband, right? And it's a false dichotomy. So does God have traits of personhood? Yes. Does God have aspects that are force-like? Yes. Can't God have both? Of course God can. That was another Kaplan mistake, right? Just because you have one doesn't mean you have the other. You all have aspects of yourself that are force-like. You occupy space. You occupy time. That has nothing to do with your being a person. But just because you occupy space and time doesn't mean you have strong opinions on who won the debate the other night. Well, you're Jews, so you have a sense of who lost the debate the other night, right? So I think God absolutely has personal traits and has impersonal traits. And sometimes I find it helpful to focus on one set, and sometimes I find it helpful to focus on others. But yes, God has mindfulness, and our purpose in life is that God is not all-knowing, meaning God cannot know what is incapable of being known, like the future, because we haven't decided our part of it yet. But God knows everything possible to know, and that is to say nothing is forgotten by God, and that includes us, so that we, all of us, live in God's mind, and when we die, we are held eternally in God's memory, and that's what the afterlife means. Thank you, everybody. Shalom.
So if you didn't get to ask your question, you'll want to come back tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon, and Sunday morning.